As I'm eating.
Good evening, everybody. How are you all? Good that you made it. How was the samosa and paneer pakode? I love. Next time.
I mean, it's some chai too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're.
See, we would have chai, and also not tiki chutney, but chai. But people would not drink it, so we would have to like take it. But next time we'll make sure. If you guys promise to come next time, we'll make sure chai is here. I'm very excited to have this lecture series. Welcome everybody to Ambedkar Lecture Series September month installment. We do Ambedkar Lecture Series every month at Harvard, and we invite speakers from across the spectrum who are interested in the issues of race, caste, gender, sexuality, migration, economics, politics, anthropology that cuts across discipline and inform us about the politics of the current state order, as well as giving us some historical record how to work with this problem that we have today. Chinmay, I met Chinmay about a year ago, I guess, at the IIM, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, where he is a professor. I'd gone there to deliver a talk, and one of our very good mutual friends, Deepak, had introduced us, and we kind of got in conversation about the politics of IIM, where there is no diversity as such represented when it comes to the representation of various castes or oppressed caste folks within its admission to the FPM, which is doctoral equivalent of doctoral program. And through that lobbying, we had some very progressive supporters and friends, and Chinmay was one of them. And when he came, and he had informed me that he was going to come to the HBS. He's a visiting faculty at the business school. And his work is largely on migration. He has degrees from London School of Economics, as well as from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. But also he's very proud of his two institutions. One is Ruia College in Mumbai, as well as Rishi Valley in Madanpalli, if that's the right pronunciation. He's been also a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. He was a 2013 Jean Monnet Fellow at Migration Policy Center, European University Institute, Florence. This institute is pretty top-notch in addressing and engaging with the migration issues as we come to see and report. And he was also a 2018 Alfred D. Chandler Jr. International Visiting Scholar in Business History at Harvard Business School, which is he right now. He has published widely on migration over a decade, and I've read some of his work on migration. And he's been also consultant to many policy-making groups. India Moving, A History of Migration is his first book. This is published by Penguin Random House. This is just published a few months ago.
Yeah, 2 months.
And this is his first international book talk. So it's going to be exciting.
Yeah.
The story of migration in a larger context of India is told in a public sphere in two phases. One is the migration of Aryans from the Central Asia or the European networks that was incoming. And there is a theory that argues that the Aryans who came from Europe established and kind of cemented caste system, solidified it, and the people who identified themselves as within the Aryan stock became default Brahmins or the what we call the dominant caste groups, and the Dravidians, which are the native Indians, became or were classified as the lower caste groups. The another during the same time, we have an out-migration from India. I mean, during the later phase of Indians moving out and traveling across Central Asia and then moving beyond in Europe, and they are known as present-day Roma population. Largely, the Roma population consists of former untouchable groups, and this population is still further, you can see across. Tony Galtif had produced a very beautiful movie on Roma migration that kind of charts out Roma existence through culture, art, and music. Lachudrom, that's the movie. Thank you. And the second wave, largely that has been told, is about the invasion migration. Of course, Aryan migration is also put in the context of invasion, but within the nationalist histories, the second wave becomes interesting, where the Musalman empire from the Persian or from the Afghani or the Turks, and afar from Arab coming into the country. From again, this context becomes through north, is about invasions, and this affront of the Muslim migration or invasion rather, is taken as always an historical reference point for the nationalist thinkers to claim the Muslim non-Indian originality. Within that discourse, when you talk about North India, in South India too, the Indian Ocean was a hotbed of immigration, trade, dating way back to 11th century recorded histories. Most importantly, the migration within the southern belt, Kerala and the neighboring region, Bombay, as they were known during that time, the ports, the Middle Eastern migration was very prominent. Sultanate of Oman was having a very prominent presence, as well as the Somalian kingdom, who were on the littorals, the Indian Ocean countries, were very powerful enough due to their control on this Indian Oceanic trade routes. So within the southern, through the connection of Arab as well as Africans coming into India, we see a diversity of color as well as food and business habits that brings new culture and religion. And we see Kerala as well as Mumbai sort of representative of those waves of migration. What does it tell us? This tells us a larger story that many currently in India and in the world, most probably also in America and across, do not want to hear about these waves of migration that have been taking place since the time immemorial. We are all told, I was in South Africa in one of the institutes of origins. Within that institute, they mapped out the first inhabitants. It was Africa, and then how over this tectonic shifts and many million years ago we became what we became. And I always think about that incident and try to understand the first humanity that was birthed in Africa and then kind of went outside. Could the world be the same if there was no migration? And migration, why is migration becoming such a negative connotation when it should be upholded for what it brings to the communities with regard to diversity as well as development of a certain infrastructure, be it social, cultural, or religious of any nation state? Currently, when we talk about migration, we think immediately about refugees. Migration in the past 2 decades has been singularly put across as pitting against the natives over the migrants, and mostly it is evoking Islamophobic sentiments because of what we have today. And in Europe, where I was a few months ago, the notion of migration is actually contested, and on the very idea of migration, we see right-wing parties are coming to fore, and they are getting stronger. Trump is a result of anti-migration rhetoric. In India, currently, we have migration crisis, an extreme, and that has been happening forever. The nationalist political groups, specifically in Maharashtra and Mumbai, who Chinmay is going to cover, and he covers in a 6th chapter, which his talk is going to drive mostly from. The Thackeray, which is a right-wing nationalist group, had actually lamented against the idea of migration, when in fact he himself was a migrant. His father, a social reformer, were in fact migrants to the part. But the notion of migration also carries with it the economic depravity. So if you have an economic prowess, you're not necessarily categorized as an immigrant who could be on the similar plane as a poor working class or a farmer who has no recourse to any sort of escape unless they have to leave. We have migration happening within Africa, humongous tensions since the post-colonial nation formations. In India too, we have migrants happening within India a lot. And through the migration, we see political nationalist parties coming into focus. We have Manase, Maharashtra Nirman Sena-like political parties who do not want the North Indians to come and so-called invade the Maharashtrian culture and fabric. Within this, we have middle class as well as upper class people trying to bake their own bread in this fight. Story of migration is very important for us for this time. When we talk about the struggles, people who are oppressed by race, gender, sexuality, caste, the people also who are oppressed by the idea of them not being able to stay in their homeland and they have to forcibly migrate. This becomes a new category. The refugees are the contemporary people or the groups who have to be part of our lexicon when we talk about oppression globally. This is an exciting day, and I think it's an exciting times to have a book. Not a better time than discussing about how India is moving. And he calls it's a great migration story. We had Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote about the warmth of sun, the great migration story from the American South to the American North, and she brings that thick 800-page almost dossier to report to us about the impacts of or the consequences of migration that are not told. We are very delighted, Chinmay, that you are here, and we are excited to hear your deliberations on a very provocative topic: Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Thackeray. I've never seen these three being put in the same line: narratives of migration. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Suraj. Very excited to be here. It's an absolute privilege to be part out here on a very important forum outside India, the Boston Study Group. It's a lot of privilege to be here as part of the Boston Study Group. It's a lot of privilege to be in Harvard, because as we know, Harvard is full of privilege. And it is, I come from a third line of privilege as someone born in India, in a big city, born male and born in upper caste. Three identities which, even if I didn't do anything in my life, I would be pretty well off, materially speaking. And an underlying theme of all these three things, the Boston Study Group, Harvard University, and my sort of social identity is migration, right? And you can't really understand success, dominance in the world of business, in the world of just basic society, without understanding migration and how these migrant networks have evolved over time. Now, this book, which I have out here, India Moving, is the first general history of migration in India. Now, when I say first, I have to be careful because, obviously a lot of people have written on migration. In fact, there have been 3,000 studies on migration in India. So I say this after having an online freely accessible monograph called the India Migration Bibliography, which lists 3,000 studies on migration. But these are 3,000 academic studies, which means it has a limited audience. And you'll see that migration studies is deeply compartmentalized into different typologies, the two main being internal versus international. So there are scholars who work only on internal migration, or scholars who work only on international, and voluntary versus involuntary. So you have a whole line of work on, say, refugee studies, and a whole line of work on, say, Mexican migration to US for work, for example. And this book tries to bring in all these strands. It has 6 chapters, and I'm going to be talking mainly about the 6th, which is about this theme about Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Thackeray. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by just giving you a flavor of what's there in the remaining 5 and build up the context towards the final chapter. How much time do you have?
You can take 30 minutes. 30. Do you want more?
No, that's yeah. Now, in the first chapter, it's called Indian Diversity and Global Migrations. What I try and argue here is that there is one view of India, which is India is a land of about 500,000 self-sufficient villages. And in this view of India, mobility, spatial mobility has never taken root in this imagination. Right? So spatial mobility is seen as something very recent. So there's the big bang of modernity about 200, 300 years back. And that's where people started moving suddenly, or the railways arrived and suddenly people started, right? And obviously technology does have an impact. But in the first chapter, I document just the amount of migrations that have taken place even before the colonial period. Right? So I document, remarkable episodes of migration. I document slavery. We think of slavery as an American concept. Right from the Arthashastra, you have very detailed accounts of slavery in Indian history. You have slavery, all sorts of social groups represented in slaves. So you have Muslim slaves who have been brought to India. Most famously, what are known as the Habshi slaves from Ethiopia to India. You have Hindu slaves being taken over to Central Asia. According to one of the famous travelers in modern day histories, the Hindu Kush mountain range is known as such because it's called the killer of Hindus, because it would kill hundreds of thousands of slaves being taken over into Central Asia. You have Bengali slaves being taken to the Dutch East Indies in the 17th and 18th centuries by the Portuguese, right? And that's there's an interesting work by Rila Mukherjee on this. And then as you come closer into the 18th century, you have more accounts of slavery. And remarkably, in all these accounts, I would say maybe compared to what's happened in America, you also find very interesting examples of upward mobility. So this is not a story of just slavery. You also have detailed accounts of reasonable opportunities where even slaves have risen to be, nobles. The most famous, of course, Qutb Minar, named after the most famous slave, Qutbuddin Aibak, was a military slave. There's a whole dynasty in India called the slave dynasty, right? So slavery is not something unique to the Americas. It is, it's been there around for a long time. And slavery, of course, gave way then to what is called as indentured labor, right? And in 1834, when slavery was abolished in some parts of the world, Indian labor and Chinese labor went and stuffed large parts of much of this world. So that's one aspect, that's one narrative. I look at, brain drain from Persia to India during the Mughal Empire. So we talk about brain drain from India to the rest of the world, but India has also been a recipient of brain drain at different points of time. I look at three different periods, broadly what historians would classify as ancient India, medieval India, and sort of modern India. But what's interesting is I look at Arthashastra very closely. Arthashastra is a treatise. We still don't know the exact date. We still don't know the exact author, but we know that something like that exists. But the Arthashastra is remarkable because it has very interesting anecdotes and clear laws on migration. And what that tells you is that there's also another image that before the 19th century, when you didn't have passports and visas, it meant that you could travel anywhere within India. And what you find in historical documents, that's not quite true. Spatial mobility has always been restricted, and often, especially on the lines of caste and gender. And so women, for example, and I document this, what I call as the Kautilian woman, in the Arthashastra, they have very clearly described norms on who can move, when can you move, what are the punishments on movement, etc. Right? There are, for example, clearly dictated rules on payment, on how much can you pay. So there are different slabs of payment, freight charges, etc. For example, in the Arthashastra, it is a punishment even to ask a Brahmin to pay for a ferry charge. Right? So they are clearly sort of described in such sense. So what I found interesting was when you look at ancient Indian history, there are not just ancient, up to pretty much modern day history, there are clearly described norms on spatial mobility. So there are two sort of views which I want to present, which I present in the first chapter. That is, India is not really a land of 500,000, villages which have never really interacted with each other, and that these interactions have and if they did interact, there were no limits on mobility. So they were clearly graded limits of mobility. And in this, I argue that one of the basic strands of interaction is actually female mobility, because the largest migration in India is female mobility for marriage. Right? So almost all the villages in India are connected because you have a strong norms on what is known as village exogamy. The woman has to usually leave the village. And so if you look at the census of India, over 300 million women are classified as migrants, because the minute you move to a next village, and often these are large distances, often there's a female deficit in some parts of India, so you have large-scale importation of brides, as this particular literature and sociology calls it. So there's been movement. So India is a land of movement. That's the first thing which I want to sort of, which I try and get in this first chapter. And there's a lot of other things, on the way. Remarkable examples of female slaves taken to Mauritius who are freed and become the richest people on the island. Remarkable sort of examples of upward mobility also expressed in India. There's some nice pictures. There are also some pictures in this book. One of Malik Ambar, who's again a very famous sort of Habshi slave. So that's the first chapter. It's talking about how India got its diversity. You can get diversity from isolation or migration, right? For example, we often take pride in India that India has so many languages, which is true. But Papua New Guinea has more languages than India, and that's because the islanders, there's very little interaction with the islanders. So each island grew up, distinct language. So the question I'm asking is Indian diversity a result of isolation or migration? And I take the view that it's because of migration, and I document these migrations. In the second chapter, I look at the last 150 years, and I argue that there's something called as the Great Indian Migration Wave. And so this is actually inspired by Isabel Wilkerson's work. I think all of you are aware, in American history, there's something called as the age of mass migration. So there's the transatlantic slave trade. Then comes the age of mass migration, which is 1880 to 1914. In fact, most of the American stock today can be traced to this particular migration wave, that is 1880 to 1914, mainly from Europe to America. And then you have the age of this thing called the Great Migration of African Americans from the South, because it was all clustered in one geographical location, to the rest of America. Right now, I'm arguing that is one these are different, clearly defined waves in Indian history. But in India, apart from this Aryan migration hypothesis, which is also discussed in the first chapter, we don't, the next phase of migration, what we call is indentured labor migration. And I depart from that. What I argue is the Great Indian Migration Wave is the longest and largest voluntary migration movement in the world, which is still ongoing. It started in the late 19th century and it's still ongoing today. And the geography is quite spectacular. It's not happening everywhere. What is this Great Indian Migration Wave? It's a migration wave of mainly men for not permanent durations, but they're spending almost their entire lives outside and then they come back. So it's circular. And the entire sort of economy in the source region runs on remittances. That is money coming from outside. And I document that over 20% of India, today that's over 200 million people, live in such remittance economies. The geography is, and what's interesting is some of the poorest parts of India and some of the richest parts of India are both, part of this. And I'll start my discussion on Ambedkar and, the rest of the characters out here from a district called Ratnagiri, which is a district just south of Mumbai. And Ratnagiri has this spectacular sort of Guinness Book World Record, almost you can call it, on sex ratios. Now, all of you heard that India has very bad sex ratios, right? Because we have a deficit of women in many parts of India. In Punjab and Haryana, it's 700, 800 women to 1,000 men. But in Ratnagiri, since 1872, when the first census took place, till now, the sex ratio of that district has never fallen below 1,200 females to 1,000 males. So I call this a phenomenon of missing men. You remember Amartya Sen calling of missing women, but this is a phenomenon of missing men. This is a staggering sex ratio, more than 1,200 females to 1,000 males. Every 15 censuses so far, every census has documented for Ratnagiri. And Ratnagiri is not the only district of India that has this. Right? So this is a remarkable phenomenon, which I want to try and get out in this book. It affects about 20% of India, not as dramatically as for Ratnagiri, but on the scale of Ratnagiri, you have a district like Udupi, where my father comes from. All the Udupi restaurants that you see up in India are part of this particular migration wave. You have a district called Saran in Bihar. You have a district called Azamgarh in UP. You have a district called Sivaganga in Tamil Nadu. In virtually every part of India, you'll find a small cluster which has developed these migrations, and they've been sustained through a lot of time. It's almost like a culture in those places where the boys grow up knowing that they have to work outside, spend a lot of time, and then come back. And as I write in this book, so Ratnagiri is not famous only for its mangoes, but also for its, mangoes, because these guys have just been going on for a really long period of time. And in fact, I documented in 1930s, there was a legislative debate on how passengers to Bombay were being displaced by mango parcels. And so there's also an interaction between these two phenomena. Now, this 20% of India that's have this Great Indian Migration Wave had led to the rise of great cities, right? So Mumbai and Calcutta had sex ratios of 400 and 500, basically females to 1,000 males. And so the leading cities of India started as male ghettos. Right? Another leading city of British India was Rangoon. So just as Indians go today to the Gulf, about 100 years back, the Gulf of India and India's imagination was on the east. It was, basically Burma, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, it was more gender balanced, the migrations, but in Burma, which was the main destination of Indians, Rangoon, over half the population, like how we have over half the population of Dubai today, for example, was completely run by Indians. Now, this is a really huge event, and that's why I label it the Great Indian Migration Wave, because if you look at the big migration waves in history, one is the transatlantic slave trade. The numbers were smaller, but it was coerced. The age of mass migration, US, shorter time, huge numbers. In India, partition, which is also, there's a whole chapter on partition in this book, was massive. That 17 million people pushed out, but that was also coerced, involuntary, largely. Whereas this, what I'm talking about, is largely voluntary sort of migration. Nobody's, putting a gun on these people and telling them to. So why did it start? Variety of reasons documented in the book. Very interesting. For a lot of these regions, it started with military service. And here I'm going to start talking about Ambedkar, because you can't understand Ambedkar's life really without understanding his father's life, right? And so Ambedkar's father, Ramji Sakpal, is a guy working in the British Army, and he's a migrant. He's one of the famous Ratnagiri migrants and Kolhapur from that broader region, going outside and serving in the British Army. So when you think of Ambedkar, such a remarkable personality, you really have to start from the beginning. How does this even begin to happen? And then we'll talk more about Ambedkar in just a bit. But what's interesting is we did a village restudy in Ratnagiri. It's a paper published. We looked at the same village for over 60 years using baseline data and so on. And what we realize in India, and this we find is a fairly general phenomenon, is that the first guys who leave the village permanently are the upper castes, followed by the middle castes, and then finally from the lower castes. Right? This is in terms of permanent sort of emigration. And what we found in this village was interesting. So the Brahmins had pretty much left the village. The middle caste still hold pretty much all the land. Middle caste in this case would be the Marathas in Ratnagiri. And what's interesting is we find that migration did wonders in terms of material upliftment for pretty much everyone in the village, but it didn't change land holdings, and it didn't really change, income distributions, occupation distributions across the castes. So absolute poverty has reduced. I mean, absolute poverty, I would say, in these villages. In fact, I went with a student team with students from Bihar. They said, "Sir, this is paradise. I mean, how can you call this to be a poor place?" But almost every 1 in 2 households has a migrant outside, sending back money. So there's not real absolute poverty, but there's relative inequality still at pretty much, and what we document, the same levels as what was there 60 years back. In terms of residential segregation, we have maps of the village 60 years back. We have maps of the village now, caste-wise. It's the same place where everyone is staying. So what's interesting is you have this massive phenomenon, everyone leaving, going to a place, coming back, but there's nothing much changing in terms of, land. You would have thought something would have changed in terms of caste demography, something would have changed in land holding, something would have changed on in residential sites where people are living, but nothing seems to change, right? There, of course, we also document very interesting forms of resistance and various other things like that. What we found in Ratnagiri also is the concept of an internal diaspora. Many of us, we talk of diaspora as an international concept. But in this book, I place a huge emphasis on the concept of an internal diaspora. And I estimate the size of India's linguistic internal diaspora to be about 60 million. That's more than double India's international diaspora of about 25 to 30 million. And so these are diasporas like Maharashtrians living in Bihar, or Biharis living in the south, and so on. And this is a massive diaspora. And what we found in Ratnagiri was that almost every village had a village-level diaspora association in the city of Mumbai. That's how strong the connection is. So this chapter on Great Indian Migration Wave is, it tells you a story of one of the most remarkable migration episodes. It's mainly on the West Coast. It's in the Gangetic heartlands of Eastern UP, Western Bihar. Not all of UP migrates, it's just one particular cluster. Particular districts in Punjab, like Jalandhar, the Eastern Punjab though. So almost everyone in Canada, for example, comes from this one small cluster. In the third chapter, I look at a very different sort of migration. So the second chapter is about the migration of labor. In the third chapter, I look at the migration of capital. And here I look at the migration of business communities. And I sort of end with two important facts. That is, today over 90% of the corporate directors of India's 1,000 largest companies belong to social groups, Brahmins and Banyas, who basically form less than 10% of India's population. So 90% of directors, less than 10% of India's population. So how do you explain this phenomenon? And I basically chronicle the migrations of Chettiars, Marwadis, Gujarati Banya, Punjabis, Sindhis, Parsis, the very famous business communities. And these business communities even today account for more than 70% of India's 100 richest business leaders. There's a variety of statistics on dominance. So Indian business is even today dominated by big business. And you cannot understand this without understanding how capital itself has gone through migration, right? What's interesting is now the success stories that are coming outside these social groups is also happening through migration. So if you look at the Gaundars in the south, if you look at the Saurashtra Patels, which is a landholding caste, who are coming up through, say, either the textile or the diamond industries, they are also coming up through migration, right? So migration is a very, very important route of spreading capital. And so this particular chapter sort of looks at a very different side of migration. In the fourth chapter, I look at diaspora. So the Great Indian Migration Wave is a narrative of circular migration, but not everyone has gone back to India, or not everyone has gone back to the village. People also settle, and that's when you get this diaspora. And here I make this distinction between internal diaspora and international diaspora, and I argue that both are very, very important. And so this is a chapter, if you always wanted to know, why there's so many Keralites in the Gulf, or why there's so many Punjabis in Canada, that's the chapter for you, because it gives you the story of how Indians have moved around the world, and practically every major region that India has gone to. In the fifth chapter, I look at involuntary migration. And so I call it three partitions, not one, but three partitions that India has faced. We talk of one partition, that is partition of 1947. And I argue that India in the 20th century had three partitions, and all of them have had massive sort of implications. The first was in 1937. And this is the partition of Burma from British India. And because Burma was like the Gulf 100 years back, where you had more than 1 million Indians there, it led to a massive refugee crisis when the Japanese attacked in 1942. And about 500,000 refugees there's a refugee crisis of about 500,000 people in 1942, 5 years before partition. So partition was not the first refugee crisis India faced. And this is a very interesting sort of part of Indian 20th century history, because Burma was the first place where Indians really migrated in large numbers to. And so I chronicle how this refugee movement happened, who was affected, and so on. Partition of 1947, I look extensively at both the Western Front and Eastern Front, how businesses were affected, how lives were affected, and some remarkable cases of even entrepreneurship flourishing. For example, in Ludhiana, the whole bicycle industry came up because of many of these refugee settlements and so on. Here, I argue that we've also often privileged these big events. So if you add up partition of 1937, 1947, and the third is the 1971 partition of Pakistan, creation of Bangladesh, which is again a refugee crisis of about 10 million people, flooding into India. And by the way, all these numbers are about 5 times bigger than the Syrian refugee crisis. Right? So this is interesting because India has had 2 major refugee crises in the last about 80 years, which somehow keeps going out of local memory. And India actually remarkably handled these, well, at least the Bangladesh refugee crisis, fairly well. And in fact, most people actually went back. Okay, but there were long sort of standing migratory routes between Assam and Bangladesh. And so some of the recent debates on this are, linked to that. And I'll be happy to take questions on this. But here the point I'm trying to make is that these 3 partitions make the headlines, but cumulatively, they've led to the involuntary displacement of about, say, 25 to 30 million people. Whereas people who've been displaced by dams, by development-induced projects, the cumulative number that in the last 50 years has been more than 50 million. And there we know the statistics that over 40% of those who have been displaced have actually been scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. So there's been this disproportionate impact of involuntary migration on certain groups. So I'm trying to square these two sort of things. In the first few chapters, I'm looking at how Indians have moved, within India and outside India. But there's a disproportionately higher propensity to migrate in these relatively voluntary migration streams among the better off or among the upper castes. And in the involuntary migration streams, you have the complete converse. So the combination of these two sort of phenomenon it's almost like a double deprivation. You have a deprivation because you lack. So if you're born in a lower caste in India, you lack the migrant network which the upper caste guy has. But you're also more likely to be pushed to some place where there's, again, I don't know, migrant network, or you're starting from scratch. So there are these two double deprivations of migration networks that happen. So this is a chapter on displacement, on Land Acquisition Act, the history of that, and there's some sort of fascinating tidbits along the way. Now the last chapter, and the last chapter is called Migration and Development. And here I look at 3 characters, so Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Thackeray. And though the book actually doesn't talk really too much about these characters, I think somewhere at the back of the running theme of this chapter are these 3 characters. So let me start with Thackeray, right? And so Bal Thackeray is a highly respected person in Mumbai. Okay, so most Mumbaikars, I would imagine, love Bal Thackeray because he's done a lot for local employment, and he was always a voice for the Marathi Manas. What's interesting is that Bal Thackeray rarely traveled in his life, and you'll see this recurring thing that people who have rarely traveled outside the particular sort of region are probably more likely to be anti-migrant than others. And this is not just an anecdote. There's a guy called Myron Weiner, one of the most famous political scientists in India in the last 50 years, and he wrote a book called Sons of the Soil, and in which he documented how people who move are actually less likely to oppose people who are moving. It's a very intuitive sort of point. But what he makes is, for example, the Gujaratis and the Punjabis, you never hear of anti-migrant sentiment in Gujarat and Punjab, right? There are pretty much, in terms of propensities, Maharashtra gets about as many migrants proportionately as a percentage of population as Gujarat and Punjab, but you never really hear much of anti-migrant sentiment in Gujarat and Punjab, right? At least relatively to Maharashtra, practically none, right? And this is interesting because the Gujarati and Punjabis themselves have been moving for a long time. So there's this clear connect between how often you have moved and how often you've usually experienced the gains of mobility versus not. Now, when Thackeray started off in the 1960s, and in a way, all these three guys are linked with some aspect of my life, which is very, very strange. But our family used to live next to the Thackerays, right? So in Mumbai. So I grew up in Mumbai. And one of the fallouts of the anti-South Indian movement, which took place in the 1960s. Firstly, the anti-South Indian movement was based on the premise that South Indians, and these are not poor South Indians, these are sort of middle-class South Indians stealing clerical jobs, secretarial jobs, etc. So that was the grouse then. 40 years later, the grouse was very different. The grouse was against Biharis, right? So the grouse changed. The anti-migrant was first South Indian, and then it became the North Indian. So even this anti-migrant sentiment can change, in terms of geography, like in a city like Mumbai. And we used to live in Shivaji Park, which is named after Shivaji. And when Bal Thackeray started his political party in 1966 in Shiv Sena, came on the back of a lot of stuff he was writing, cartoons depicting something like SI vultures. This became like a brand, South Indian vultures, and that was the imagery used for migrants then. But apparently we were family friends. These are, of course, tales from our families. And one of the fallouts was that we actually changed our surname. So Tumbe is, most people think it's a Maharashtrian surname, but it's actually a village in coastal Karnataka. And we chose the surname because it sounds Maharashtrian, right? So it's got a very nice, Maharashtrian thing. And because there's a Tambe and, there's a Tembe, but we are actually the only Tumbes in the world. Right? You can Google this. And this is, thanks. So that's why he's in the book. So Bal Thackeray had this, larger than life personality, and he could actually up the rhetoric against migration. What's interesting is that migration to Mumbai never really stopped, right? So, and this is interesting because you always have rhetoric, but rhetoric is very rarely matched with actual sort of policies which actually stop migration, right? At least in the Mumbai. And if you look at the other big city, Calcutta, where there was no anti-migrant sentiment, but actually migration slowed down considerably, right? In fact, there was flight of a very different kind. So there's capital flight, the Marwadis left the city and so on. And that is because there was this, the massive sort of one theory, claims it on very sort of anti-capital, sort of massive trade unionism, which led to a flight of capital from Calcutta. That's one theory. There are other theories, fertility decline. Calcutta is, you won't believe it, but there are wards in Calcutta where the population is falling. Right, so this is a remarkable. In India, population never falls, but in Calcutta and some wards, because the fertility rates are very, very low. Be that as it may, Calcutta has a very, very slow population growth in the last 60 years. In fact, today's the growth rate is about 0.5% per annum, which is practically nothing. In Bombay, it's still about 2.5% per annum. So that's big difference. And what Thackeray managed to do was galvanize this opinion consistently, over a long time, especially in the 60s and then later in the late 90s and 2000s against migration. And what we gather from this is two things. One is that the anti-migration rhetoric is almost always premised on absolutely no evidence. That is, the first thing. I mean, you can easily say stuff, but there's absolutely no evidence. So, for example, stealing jobs, absolutely no evidence. Which jobs? Are there any numbers? So there's never any evidence provided for that. And secondly, it is a very easy route because it does win you votes, right? So it is politically a very, very powerful rhetoric, and that is why it keeps working, whether it's in Assam today or in Mumbai in the past. Now, so Thackeray represents one spectrum of attitudes to migration, and Ambedkar, I argue, represents the other spectrum, and Gandhi lies in between. So this is why I'm getting these three characters is because if you think of a spectrum of narratives of migration or attitudes to migration, there are three people on a particular line, if you can imagine it that way. And so at the other end, you have Ambedkar. Ambedkar, the chapter, in fact, starts with a quote from Ambedkar. He's saying, mobility is the best thing possible. What it does, it brings you ideas from one place to another. Right? I mean, his idea of spatial mobility was firstly from the basic idea that you will learn stuff when you go out. And in Ambedkar's writings, there's a clear sort of, especially over the years, clearly you can see the sort of the value he places on the dignity that he received, especially when he was in America, relative to what was happening in India, and the really liberating feeling, right, of being in a place where caste is not your primary identity. So I have a lot of quotes actually throughout all chapters, from one of these people. But in the case of Ambedkar, for example, the train was itself a very liberating experience for Ambedkar. He says caste stops momentarily on the train, which is interesting because Gandhi was shoved off a train in a very, very different context in South Africa. That was the basis of class and color. Out here, but Ambedkar had a very different view of what the railway train symbolized. By the way, there's a whole section on the train, and there's about almost 2,000 words on how train has been so important for migrants. And the cover page has a train, of course. So the second reason why Ambedkar is so important on this topic is he had a very clear view that migration, especially rural to urban migration, was a good thing, period. Right? And this is very important because in the last 70 years of Indian independence, there has been an inherent policy bias saying that rural to urban migration is a bad thing. Right? In fact, when I gave my economics exam, something called as net exam, to if you want to be a teacher in India, sometimes you have to give something called as a net exam. The first question on my economics exam was, state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. Not critically examine, state the problems. Right? And that just tells you how the question has been framed in itself. And Ambedkar was very clear that this is a good thing. All societies have urbanized. This is part of development. And for him, it was especially because leaving your particular. For him, it's not that caste disappears. It is never Ambedkar's claim or anybody's claim that caste disappears in a city. In fact, there are a lot of studies which show how caste is vital. It doesn't disappear, etc. in a city. But in relative terms, there is now considerable evidence, right? Whether you look at the National Family Health Surveys, whether you look at the National Sample Surveys, whether you look at the census, on almost all material counts, better, right? So the urban experience is relatively much, much better compared to the rural experience. Now that was Ambedkar. Ambedkar also had certain other views, which I can talk at later. Now Gandhi is somewhere in between because Gandhi is a cosmopolitan, right? Gandhi has traveled across India, he's traveled across the world, but he recommends fixity. Okay, so he's a cosmopolitan who says, what, in a way, I can move, but people should be. This whole idea of the self-sufficient village, which is underlying this idea that rural-urban migration is bad. This is the underlying idea that India lives in its villages, and we should bolster the villages so that people live there, and they don't need to come to the cities, which are anyways very crowded, very polluted. So this is the framing ideology, and you'll be surprised as to how many people living in cities today completely agree with that, saying that if we develop the villages enough, then people will not need to come to the cities. Now this is a very attractive idea, because if you say something like do something good and then people won't need to come, it might sort of hinge at a very sort of interesting level. But the experience across the world and within India is that with more rural development, you get more rural outmigration. Right? So whether you look at Punjab, whether you look at coastal Andhra, the two richest parts of agricultural India, what happened with wealth was people moved to the towns for the simple reasons that as your income grows, as productivity rises, you don't want to do backbreaking work on farms. That is one way to look at it. Right? So rural to urban migration, Ambedkar realized very early on, is a very fundamental factor of development. Now this is not a case that you should not do anything for villages, but it's a very different philosophy out here that you do a lot for villages with the recognition that people will still leave. Right? That's a very completely different way of looking at rural development, knowing that the urbanization is anyway inevitable and it's going to take place. Okay, urbanization is the most stylized fact of development. There is no other sort of fact of development. Societies which have had rise in material living standards have seen urbanization rates go up from 0% to 80% or so. Right? And India, by the way, is actually still very low on urbanization. A lot of definitional issues, but as per the census, 31%. But even if you change the definition, it's about 40%, 50%. China, it's much more. It's about 55%. And one of the sort of drawbacks of this Gandhian philosophy on migration, I argue in this book, is that because rural development has got so much of priority in terms of even funding, there's actually been massive underfunding of cities in India. Okay, There's a whole literature which developed in the 60s and 70s, something called as urban bias. How is, everyone's, because all the guys who are making policies are living in cities, so they are concerned about themselves. But the fact is that in India, in terms of funding, cities never got the money. So one of the reasons why Indian cities are a mess, and you can see the logic out here. People are saying, people should not come to Indian cities because it will add to the pollution. It will add to the problems of the city. But the fact is that cities never got the money to produce the basic infrastructure for people to live in the city in the first place. Right? So this is a very, it's like a circular logic. And you'll see this, because I had a lot of book talks in India, everyone said, but these guys should not come. And this is a very patronizing attitude, because almost all of us are in this room live in cities or will live our life in cities. And to now say, because we are all migrants or descendants of migrants, first, second, third, maybe 4 generations, to say, okay, we have come, but you cannot, right? That's probably the most patronizing attitude that one can have on migration issues. And what's remarkable is that Gandhi had these issues. But when you read Gandhi closely, right, it's clear that even he was not so, bounded on fixed. So I've quoted Gandhi at length on this, that even Gandhi said that, if there is oppression, in his words, the Harijans should move. And I've quoted this whole paragraph of Gandhi on this. So even Gandhi is very clear that if there is, systematic oppression in a particular place, and there is absolutely no other choice, then I will be okay with people moving en masse. So he is on record saying that as well. So he was not completely, anti-migration per se. Gandhi also had an interesting view on brain drain, and that's another aspect of Gandhi's view on migration. And this is remarkable, and especially when you look at, say, intellectual biographies, how a person's sort of view changes over time. And so when Gandhi was a teenager, practically, when he was about to set off for studies in England, in fact, one of the first ever recorded speeches of Gandhi is, in his college, when he's saying, okay, I'm going to England, and all of you should look at my example and come back to serve the country. And that, that was as a very young person. And then later on, towards the end of his life, a reporter asked him, what do you think after independence, should Indians go abroad and study? And Gandhi said no. He said that what I did was a mistake. I was too young, I was too naive, but India needs its people. And so, Indians should stay here and work for the country. And so it's a completely 360-degree view on immigration for this. Of course, the reality is very different. There was a massive discourse of brain drain which built up in the 1960s and 70s, because a lot of the people from the IITs and IIMs subsidize education and then going outside. Even today, you might hear these arguments somewhere. But today, we no longer talk of the brain drain. Right? In fact, we talk of words like brain gain, brain circulation. Right? It's very different language has developed. And that's because what we've realized is that actually it doesn't matter if people have gone abroad. India has actually benefited on net terms. Why? Principally economic. India gets roughly about 2% of GDP worth economic remittances from people outside India. In fact, without remittances, our rupee right now would have been at 100 or 120. Right? So workers' remittances, and both low-skilled in the Gulf and high-skilled in the US and other countries support India's balance of payments remittances. $70 billion. That's how much India gets as remittances, and about half of that is from high-skilled. About half of that is from low-skilled, roughly, or low or semi-skilled. And so because of this obvious benefit, because of obvious demonstration effects, people have been inspired by people who have done well outside. And the two big achievements of India have been in the IT and health sectors in terms of business. And both these sectors happened through the diaspora. Right? So IT came to Bangalore because of a very clear diasporic connection, connecting places, Boston and Silicon Valley to Bangalore. And the health sector in, for example, Hyderabad. So if you look at Divi Labs or many of these, big firms today, they all also have this diasporic connection with the US. So there's a clear activation of industry which has happened through these transfers of information, knowledge, of capital. Right? And so today, this whole discourse on brain drain, nobody talks about brain drain anymore. And one member of the Planning Commission long back had this famous saying, a brain drain is better than a brain in a drain. Right? So he had this very interesting view saying that let people go to where they can be productive, and that matters. But I talk of slightly two different brain drains which have not been talked about. One is a lot of the brain drain from India is gendered. Right? So you have the visa issue. Most software workers are men, and their wives are on the dependent visa, the H4 and the H1B. And these are really, as some guys, studies have shown, depression visas. Right? Because you live in the US and you practically can't do anything. Right? I've lived in the US as a student dependent, and it's crazy because you can't do anything. Now this is substantially about 100,000 H4 visa holders from India alone, right? And almost all of them are women. So this is an aspect of brain drain which nobody talks about. Another aspect is the internal brain drain, right? And similarly, within India, also, we have one of the lowest female workforce participation rates in the world. People are moving, but not everyone is working, right? This last chapter sort of concludes with some broad ideas of, what might the future look like. A couple of things I sort of observe here in terms of patterns for the future. One is this great Indian migration wave, mainly of labor. Earlier, which was eastbound, people were going to Calcutta or Burma or Malaysia, all the east, then became westbound. People started going to Punjab, to Delhi, to Mumbai, to Surat. Now it is going south. In the sense, from the north, it's going south. And this is going to be the defining migration wave of our lifetimes. You already see today, there are over 2 million people from North India working in Kerala today. So though the Keralites are working in the Gulf, there are also Biharis going to Kerala. You find people from West Bengal, from Madhya Pradesh going down south. And what's interesting is earlier there was a language barrier because you had to learn South Indian languages. But today the wage differential is so high that it doesn't matter. So you might as well learn the language, but you're getting the job and you're getting the money. So north to south migration is a huge phenomenon which is going to happen in the future. I'm going to talk a bit about climate change. We talk about Bangladeshi migration, or look of it as a problem. Well, if you think it's a problem, it's going to actually get worse, because climate change, one of the most affected places in the world, is going to be Bangladesh, right? So it's a low-lying area, flood prone, and so you're going to get more sort of environmental refugees coming in from there. And third, as India sort of grows, you're also going to see a lot of immigration. You're already seeing it today. You see immigration, you're seeing of, say, African students, right? But also more, if you go to Bangalore, Mumbai, it's got now a lot of, white European and American workers coming in. Overall, this community is now estimated to be about maybe 30,000, but this could go up to about 500,000 to 1 million in the coming years. And broadly, I sort of end this book by saying that, mobility is in general good. Obviously, nobody, if you're going to be kicked out, that's not a good kind of mobility. And so there are 4 core arguments of this book. The first is that migration in India has happened in the past, and there has been substantial scale and variety. Okay, and one of the things that the book is trying to do is document the stunning variety of migrations, from slavery to completely voluntary kind of migrations, to indenture, different recruitment systems, etc., etc. A lot of institutions which have been involved in this. I talk about the railways, but more than the railways, the Post Office of India has been the most important institution for migrants. Right? In fact, I have a paper on the postal money order. It's the most famous financial instrument used by migrants historically. That's the first argument, that migration is not something which just started in the last 20, 30, or 100 years. It has pretty much been there in substantial scale and variety throughout the ages. The second is that Indian migration, when you look at other countries especially, has been much more circular in nature, right? Which means people not only go, but they also come back. And that's a very interesting feature. And I argue that one of the fundamental reasons that is because of the gender imbalance. So most work-related migration in India, even today, is heavily male-dominated. Right? So even today, if you look at the sex ratio of Surat, I think it's gone below 800. So there are that many more males, in the city. And so what this means is that demographically, India is relatively static, because there's a lot of migration, but there's also people going back. So for every incoming cohort in Mumbai, you also have an outgoing cohort of old migrant workers who are retiring and going back to Eastern UP or Bihar or wherever they came from. Right? As a result of which, urbanization in India is much slower than what is happening in China. Because in China, even the women are moving into cities in much larger numbers. So that's one aspect of circular migration. And the circular migration is happening across castes, though you could say that the sort of more permanent migration happens at the upper caste spectrum. So one is on scale, one is on circularity. The third argument is of this migration of capital. And so you can't understand this whole idea of dominance of certain communities in Indian business without understanding this particular story of the migration of capital. And lastly, argue that migration has been very central to if you say that India has had a pluralistic tradition, at least at some point of time, or that India has the stunning diversity of communities that you see today, that migration has contributed to it. Right? And so this is a very important part of it. Not all groups have benefited from migration, and that's the running theme of this book. In every epoch, some groups have benefited, some groups have benefited more. And in a way, this idea that, I say that the low-ranking castes of India, continue to be disempowered by the lack of substantive spatial mobility. Right? And I'll end with just this, personal anecdote of when I had to do higher education in the UK. It was fairly simple in the sense that I already had friends, I already knew somebody in the UK, and it made my transition to UK very, very simple. I have a student now who had a full, government of Maharashtra scholarship to do a PhD in the US, and who just couldn't do it because of this lack of a migrant network. Right? And this student comes, from a different caste. This is a basic difference of having a migrant network, the privilege of having a migrant network. So I'm very proud of the fact that I have families, across. I can go to practically anywhere in the world today and live with a friend or a family, right? But that is also privilege of historic migrations, right? And that it's best captured in the urbanization statistics. So we have only we said India is about 31% urban, but the urbanization rate among the scheduled castes is about 24%. That 8 percentage point difference is the penalty of not being in the city and not having the information. And that's the core message of the book, that the lack of informational networks is impeding a lot of progress in India. And that is why, so to end, the Boston Study Group has these famous words of Ambedkar: organize, educate, agitate. The fourth one is migrate. Okay.
Thank you.
Stop.
Thank you so much, Chinmay. It was a very it was almost a story that I got lost into. It took time for me to come back. This was almost like a pop book talk, which is itself academically rigorous text, but the way we are dealing with this issue has to do beyond the academic canon, and it has to do with our experiences. Chinmay had touched upon various issues, talked about slavery and how the slave dynasty sort of comes to form in India, how slaves also get into the upper echelons of and very famous, especially Razia Sultana's second partner was himself a slave, was called quote unquote Habshi, and then he also touched upon the Arthashastra, which kind of caste codified the segments of population. And I think this is where the mobility kind of stands. Caste is about lack of mobility, because the very aspect of caste is to being affixed into this. Whereas migration, as Chinmay ended, allows you the mobility. So it goes against the very ethos of so-called Indian culture vis-a-vis the caste culture. And that's why I think there has been, I was constantly thinking about this paradox that when caste doesn't allow you mobility, how could other groups within the caste themselves get mobile? Didn't it violate it? There was a famous law of or rather a code where you didn't go Sat Samundar Par, you're Kalapani, where it was known as Kalapani, that you don't migrate. If you migrate, you lose your caste and status. So that was basically an injunction. But during the indenture era of British colonial times, many lower caste and untouchables left. They said, screw you, we are anyway tortured here. What the hell is going to happen there? And that's why we see the wave of migration within the Caribbean as well as the Indian Ocean regions and across. Mostly indenture workers are from this hardworking caste. And then you also talked about the migration of capital, which I found very exciting. The dependability brain drain is something I think that has really missed out on me, and I think many of us can relate. If you have a friend or whose spouse is him or her having nothing to do but just to stay at home and can't do much of that. So I think these are exciting points and discussions on table. Let's open up for questions or comments. When you ask a question or comment, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at the MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and I work on migration to Southern Europe in particular. First of all, I want to say I didn't know you published a book. I thought you were going to talk about your colleagues' work. I'm just really excited that I look forward to getting it.
Oh, by the way, the books are here, so you can get the book.
Oh,
at
so
the
I
end.
can get it. Yeah, it's amazing.
Also,
I would, the whole time I was thinking,
do this.
how am I going to get it? It's sold here.
I should have mentioned it.
I also
Because there's a
forgot.
book box here. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. It's really good. I had two questions. The first one relates directly to my work, and you were talking in the same way as we are, adamant and sort of unwavering about our defense of the freedom of movement, the freedom of settlement of people, and its liberatory forms. In my experience of where I did field work with daily wage laborers in agricultural parts of Italy who are from the region of Jalanda, working 14 hours a day in terrible conditions, there was a sense that this was what, that data would call voluntary migration.
Yeah.
And yet, so what is this distinction? I mean, between voluntary and involuntary migration? And sometimes when we see the ways that, global capital has ways of plundering in neo-colonial ways, parts in particular of sub-Saharan Africa, we have to believe in some sense that this voluntary migration is not always the beautiful story of movement, the idea. It's a story of exploitation, and of exploitation of the West on the global South that continues through migration as well. So as much as we defend the freedom of movement of people, and we should be absolutely unwavering on this, there's also the freedom of being able to stay home and to develop there and to not, because my fear is that when we start thinking that way, then we end up thinking like these two economists, Whale and Posner, who last year published this article where they said, well, America should have an immigration policy that's like the Gulf countries, because remittances are great for GDP of poor countries. So let people come with no sense of being citizens, being exploited, basically new indentured labor, but the money will go back eventually, and it will enrich their country of origin. And that's a way of thinking that in a sense I'm afraid of. And I always think about this friend of mine when I lived in Europe, who was from Greece, and he had been there for 5 years. It was in London, and he was saying, it's like, why I haven't seen my family in 5 years. Why would I come here? Greece is beautiful. It's just there are no jobs. So the question that we're asking is like, why did he have to leave?
Yeah.
And that asks us question about global capital. So that's one thing. The other thing is genuinely a question, and something that I don't know much about, so I'd like to hear all of you talk about, is the question of caste in Indian migration, right? If you ask an American today whose great-great-grandfather came from Italy, there's a high chance that like now, or a Moroccan that went to France in the late 19th century, there's a high chance that now this person is not married to a Moroccan, or the Italian is not married to Italian. Perhaps the last thing, he doesn't speak the language anymore. And perhaps the last thing is kept of that identity is, some aspects of food or some cultural relic of that identity. Whereas something quite striking about Indian diasporas is how much caste is resilient within Indian diasporas. And how much, somebody who's, some Patel from Gujarat, whose great-great-grandfather went to Tanzania or Kenya, will still, hundreds of years later, continue to, reproduce amongst the Patel caste and reproduce cultural practices that belong to the Patel. So that's something I was curious about, is how does that experience of Indian migration differ from other places in the world, and that specificity of caste? It makes it so that you move, but you move while holding, and I'm sure a lot of people here are more familiar, because there's a big body of work about caste, in America and in England, about how people keep that caste oppression, forms of caste oppression and resilience within the...
I'll start with the second question, and it's there in the book as well. So caste in Indian diaspora is now again international Indian diaspora. In some countries, so if you look at Fiji, for example, or Mauritius, which were really the first. I mean, we're talking about 1840s, that kind of migration. Fiji in the 1870s. This is, of course, I have never been to these places. So what I can say is based on, the work that has been done on these places. It seems that in these places, caste has dissolved into race or ethnicity as a very defining identity in those places. But you're right that I think what's striking is that marriage practices have not changed, right? So endogamy is still very, very strong. So I'll make a difference of that. That is, it's not caste practices per se, but it is endogamy which is a very, very strong element that has stayed on. And of course, we know, it reproduces through that. But I think various other features of caste, many of these studies have documented, have just withered away. So that's that. We know, of course, in the US, so this is work by Devesh Kapoor and others. The book is called The Other 1%, right? And it's probably the best book written on Indians in the US till now. The other 1%, right? Because Indians make up about 1% of Indian population. But Indian migration to the US has been one of the most selective migration streams in human history, according to Devesh Kapoor and others. And they call it triple selection. Firstly, US favored high skilled, and for a couple of reasons in India, only those who could enable this higher education could go. So what you get in the US is a completely sort of skewed distribution of the Indian population in general. But but the US is a much more recent sort of phenomenon. So I'd make a distinction. Now, of course, he's been in South Africa, so I think he's in a better position to tell us, what's happening in South Africa. But my sense is from the old diaspora, international diaspora, caste has stayed in marriage practices, but not so much in any other form. So, which means what I'm saying is that because these societies had, people of different castes migrating, having brown skin, the people have coalesced around that identity more than anything else. So they've also been in caste marriage, but not so much outside Indian sort of ethnicity marriage. So that's what it seems, at least, in many of these places.
There are regional sort of distinctions. So if you are from the Tamilian, especially in South Africa and Zimbabwe, there's this distinction. You are Tamilian, you're Gujarati, and Hindi. It's kind of clear marking distinction. And so they marry within themselves. So Tamilians mostly continues to be the most marginalized and disfavored immigrant groups in that part of the world.
Yeah, the first point is very clear. And again, I talk about this. So when I say voluntary, I'm just trying to make it as a distinction between the harshest forms, which is slavery and indenture. I write a lot about how exploitative it can get, but of course, I lived in Italy, so I know this particular thing that you're talking about. But for example, Kerala to Gulf, right, which is also under what you said, exploitative terms. But however you look at it, there are about more than 5 million people who've gone to the Gulf and come back. And there is absolutely no doubt, and there have been studies after studies showing that it has, in terms of wealth and economic status, these guys are now at a different level. And the guys who are, doing construction work are now living in palatial houses. And in terms of economic material mobility, now, of course, that's led to other sets of problems, consumerism and, other sets of issues. But there is no doubt that people have made certain choices. They've seen that, okay, it's potentially, bad, but it's always, this is the thing about migration, is always to look at it in terms of relative terms, right? Where are you coming from and how much are you gaining from it? Now, in Punjab, what's interesting is that a lot of the migration there's happening from the sort of debt-driven distress which has happened in the last 20 years when agriculture has not provided the gains that it used to do, just after the Green Revolution. And so there's this whole drug addiction problem in Punjab. And so there's a very different set of drivers of the migration that you're talking about. So absolutely agree with you that voluntary migration does not mean no exploitation. But having said that, a lot of these migrations in the Great Indian Migration Wave have sort of, led to a lot of upward mobility for either regions or communities. And the best example I can give you is Ratnagiri, because that's a place I've studied at length. There is practically no absolute poverty in Ratnagiri, but the inequalities exist of a very different kind. So it's a region in the great, or Udupi. Udupi is, in Karnataka. Bangalore, there's a Human Development Index ranking of districts. Bangalore is number 1 in Karnataka, and Udupi is number 2. And Udupi has a sex ratio of something like 1,200 for the last 120 years. And so migration has been a very important part of this upward mobility story. And there are guys, Brahmin cooks and the bunts, and then all the whole different caste groups who have gone out, made a lot of money. But what's interesting is they go back. And this is, to me, the remarkable story that most of these guys in this Great Indian Migration Wave actually go back to where they're coming. And that's partly because the women are not moving, so then they're tied through that. There are places in India in the Great Indian Migration Wave which have seen practically no mobility. For example, in West Bihar. So Saran is the classic case of what you're talking, where you have generations and generations of migrant workers going out, first, to the jute mills of Calcutta, then to Punjab. But if you see Saran today as a region, it's not the best part of the world. and definitely in relation to Udupi or Ratnagiri. So they all started off at similar levels 120 years back, but nothing has changed. And I agree in the book that one of the important things out here is how migrants have invested in education. And you'll see in the West Coast, the education has been of such great importance, especially in the destination regions. These Udupi guys, there's a whole section of the Udupi guys, they had night schools in Mumbai. They would educate their community in the night schools. So these guys, they're poor migrant workers, but they'll still learn something at the end of the day. But you don't see. So over time, these migrations lead to something more than what has happened in other parts. Coastal Orissa is another place which has had massive.
Before Nikki, I go to you. We have this sign-up sheet. Please sign up. And also, if you are tweeting or Facebooking, just use this at the back. I always forget this today. I remember Nikki, you, and then Sanjeev.
So my name is Nikki Nesbitt, and I run a program called the Caribbean Youth Club, which provides resettlement support for newly arrived Afro-Caribbean youth. And I also run a women's network that provides support for women and girls serving organizations. My question for you, coming from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, and I am well acquainted personally with just having Indians as a part of our society,
Correct.
right? Indians were brought in to replace slave labor in the 1850s.
Yeah.
And my own husband is actually half Indian.
Yeah.
Right? He's from Trinidad. So it's a common part of our society, and I understand a lot of what you say on a personal level. But what I've never fully understood was what were the push factors for the upper caste Indians to leave? I don't fully.
That's a good point. Let me answer.
Okay.
Let's go. Today, I'm answering your question, but I'm starting from a different point.
Yeah.
The poorest part of India is Bihar. Is a state called Bihar. Many people who went to Jamaica came from there. The richest part of India today, on most indicators, is Kerala. So Bihar and Kerala. And they both have the same rates of out-migration. The poorest part of India and the richest part of India have the same rates of out-migration, but they're going to different destinations. So the guys in Kerala are not going within India, they're going outside India. And the guys within from Bihar, they're also going outside, but they're mainly going within India. So the fundamental driver of any migration is better, at least these kind of migrations, is better economic opportunities, what economists would call as a wage differential, at a very basic level. But there is a common factor binding Bihar and Kerala, and that is population density. And what in India we don't realize is, this density varies tremendously across India. And so the guys who came to Jamaica, they were coming from a region which were the densest rural tracts in the 19th century. So this district Saran, which sent many people to Jamaica, for example, it had a population density of something like 900 people to a kilometer square in the 19th century, when across the world it was about 100, 200. So that's the basic. Now you can ask, why was population density so high? It's again, if you go back into history, regions which are well endowed with water, in India rainfall is a big thing, but also regions which didn't have too much warfare, right? So over time, in India, the basic killers of population have been, famines and war. And so if you escape famine and war, over time, populations built up. And it's a fundamental feature of density that there's only that much that agriculture can support. And so the minute you have these tipping points on population, people start to move. So the fundamental reason why Bihar and Kerala have this natural pressure of out-migration is because they have extremely high rural population densities. And that is why even the upper castes, there's just no opportunities, right? Because if you have 900, there are particular jobs, there are enough people who are doing that jobs. And so even if you're upper caste, you might need to go somewhere else to get your job. Whereas if you're living in a region like in central India, which hardly is part of this great Indian migration wave story, densities of 100, 200 people, there's enough for something to do for everybody. So that's the sort of fundamental reason. What's interesting also is the recruiters were upper caste. The guys who recruited the guys were upper caste. And over time, though it started off as indenture, many places indenture broke down and became a family-based recruitment system. So the recruiter would go back to the village and get his people, right? And so that became automatically a network of people to go to. So it's very interesting because when you look at the Indian diaspora across the world, some places got, if you look at a caste distribution, some places got more of the lower caste, but some places on indentured labor had more or proportionately more upper castes. Right? So indenture is not just a story of the lower caste moving. I mean, different countries had different sort of shocks. So my answer is basically density and the sort of need to migrate in particular parts of India. Yeah. So yeah.
Sanjeev.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question out of curiosity, and then I have a comment. So
yeah.
So you mentioned about Odisha,
yeah.
and I'm actually
Odisha.
Yeah. Sorry.
Odisha is the official spelling.
Odisha.
Yeah.
So so I'm actually researching the plumbers who come from one particular district in Odisha.
Which district?
Kendrapada.
Yeah.
And so historically they have migrated to Rangoon.
Correct.
And actually during the World War II they had to actually flee and actually walk back. So they didn't have even commute or transport.
Yeah.
So so I'm wondering if you have come across, because I'm still struggling to find immigration records of these guys in Odisha or Odisha archives. Maybe.
So you're studying, or you're doing this as a project, or like?
I'm a postdoc. This is my postdoc project.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So I'm mapping the trajectory of this plumbing communities from one particular district, not even a district, but one particular cluster of villages in this district.
Yeah. So I mean, we should have a long talk after this, but. Very quick point. There's a whole section, there are 1,000 words in the book on Ganjam, which is not very far from.
There's something I was about to mention.
Yeah.
So Ganjam sent the most number of the people to Rangoon.
Exactly.
But they worked as agricultural laborers.
Exactly, yeah.
But Kendrapada sent people who worked as plumbers. And there are different migration and other kinds of networks and how that played out and all.
Yeah.
So
So in the book, this is a very interesting question, because what happened. So this is a story of coastal Orissa. It's in the east. And coastal Orissa is part of the Great Indian Migration Wave. Elevated sex ratios for more than 100 years and so on. Earlier, mainly going to Burma in the east, but today a lot of them going to Gujarat. So Gujarat is the main. And so I, for my PhD, studied Surat and Odia workers in Gujarat. So I've gone to Ganjam and interviewed migrant workers. But what's interesting is in the case of this Ganjami switch from Burma to Gujarat, east coast to west, coast to coast, is agricultural labor. But the first recorded jobs in Surat in the 1670s are, and they were called as malis. So basically they're in gardening, because they were doing 60s and 1960s and 1970s. Yeah. So that's the first reference that you get to, people. So I've done a similar thing of what you're trying to do for a different part of Orissa, for a different trajectory. But today there are over 200,000 Ganjamis in Surat city alone. Right. And this is a distance of about, several thousand kilometers. I've traveled with these migrant workers. It's Puri Okha Express, it's one of the longest train journeys in India, 53 hours. And it's really a remarkable, story. So there's a whole section on this in the book. But I'm very fascinated because I do mention Odia plumbers.
And also in Dubai and Gulf countries.
Yeah.
And it also the interesting point you're making about mobility and migration, and that links up with my comment. So now the Dalit communities have started migrating.
Correct.
Earlier times,
there
are many issues that have to be analyzed, not just migration, but why the Dalit community is not able to move out or perhaps have residence in cities and all. So it's a larger sort of topic to analyze. But so this relates to the kinds of debates we're having. So should we really look at mobility as an emancipatory force, or is mobility replacing forms of inequality? I think the ethical and political engagement has to do with what perhaps Hart and Negri are talking about. Capital can move, but labor cannot.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you talk about Odisha, you have, you had the sort of largest FDI investment. Of course, POSCO had withdrawn, and it's a very mineral resource sort of state, and you have poverty being reproduced. So capital can go extract and come back well, but labor cannot. So the ethical and political engagement has to do with perhaps going beyond a nationalistic, a methodological nationalistic framework, and perhaps raise questions about citizenship.
Could be,
So it's not like in Gulf countries, for instance, the monarchies. You create your own citizens as plans and bring these populations and make them work without giving them any rights. Or let it be in Trump's America, right?
Yeah.
Or in any country. So that's what I was thinking.
Fair enough. And I would add to this, and I have a paper on this. It's called Transnational Indian Business. It's not just capital and labor, but capital also follows labor sometimes. That's a very different kind of a movement. So a lot of capital. So the indentured labor migration actually activated a lot of business communities to go and serve these guys as well. And then over time they became rich. That's another angle to this particular story. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what the basic thrust of it.
So we also have an online question. We'll take first yours. Could you introduce, and then is there anyone else? 2, 3, and then we'll take the fourth question.
Sure.
Okay.
Cool. I'm Ria. I'm a freshman at the college. I was wondering about lower caste migration to cities and the circularity of that, because a lot of lower caste people migrate to cities in the hope of pursuing a job that is not like informed by their caste.
Yeah.
And then returning to their villages then poses a problem, because how can they return to a village that they've left to pursue something entirely different?
We'll take a cluster.
Yeah. So my question is on, you of course spoke about the importance of a social network in a city or migration destination. But how much of the urban migration do you think is linked to traditional caste skill sets? For example, a lot of the people in the academia, or perhaps Brahmin, because of the British patronage of the bureaucracy and education. Or if you look at, say, the massive speculators from the Fatehpur Shekhawati region in Rajasthan, the extreme drought, most of them going to Bombay and being the capitalists of business houses today. Or even in Gujarat, the case of Gujarat, where you have a lot of craftsmen, cultures, that kind of caste that got into construction or say the diamond polishing trade in Surat, and eventually now again are like the multi-crore.
Okay.
And that's something, that skill set is not something that tribal communities have necessarily had. So I'm just speculating. How much do you think is to do with skills?
Can I add one brief point on that? Sure. I mean, I see Kasliwal and Maliwal across India, and they speak various languages. They've assimilated. Similarly, Jain communities. And, I always wonder, is caste even a sentiment that operates within this Baniya community, who is vociferously, kind of, in a way, promiscuous when it comes to maintaining units? Were you there? Yeah.
I'm Pavana Gyari. This is my first time being here, so wonderful book talk. Thank you.
Welcome.
If I don't have a question, it's a comment. I'm probably the least knowledgeable about the topic, I must confess. I come from technology sector and I see the effects of global warming. And you briefly touched on effects of global warming in Bangladesh. But if you see any of the simulation tools like C-Roads, for instance, you see by about 30 or 40 years, you see most of these densely populated coastal areas underwater. I couldn't help but wonder how that will affect the immigration and the patterns of immigration in the next 20 years.
Then we have a final question from Vijay Bagde, who is in Saudi Arabia. He says, why marginalized communities are so thin in numbers in terms of migration compared to upper caste, and what are the suggestions to encourage them? It's a policy-making question now.
Thanks for this excellent question. So one is this shame of return, and this is the theme. I would say the shame of return in migration extends to everyone, right? So Punjabi, cab drivers in New York will never tell their relatives back home that they're driving cabs because they didn't go there to drive cabs, but that's what they're doing. So for practically every person who has maybe not met the expectations of what migration ought to do, there is always some amount of shame. But in India, I mean, the dominant theme is circulation, because most people are actually returning. There are a lot of camouflages which happen. So people often lie. Right? So people say that I did this, but they actually never did that. So that's the most obvious strategy that people would use. Your other thing of in this a lot of the circularity, is it overrepresented in the lower ranking castes? It is. So statistically, it is. And one of the reasons that happens is for the simple fact of not having enough of a capital base to start with. So it is expensive to live in a city, right? So if you live in Boston, for a year versus for a month, you'll probably you'll strategize your migration decisions such that you just want to stay like a few days and then go back. And you don't mind making multiple trips if that works out to be cheap. So just from a purely like starting wealth kind of a basis, historically and even today the numbers are very stark. The low ranking castes are much more likely to participate in shorter distance circular migrations than other same. But on this other point of shame of return, I have a point on Dalit entrepreneurship in this book. And what this book, again, by Devesh Kapoor and others talks about is rural to urban. So in their sort of book documents 21 Dalit millionaires. And a theme that was emerging out of all these guys was how important rural to urban migration was initially. And precisely the fear of failure was not there. That is because any entrepreneur, anybody who's done entrepreneurship knows that you fail often. Right? Often it doesn't work out. But their point to these guys was that, in a city when nobody knows us, we don't mind failing. But if we fail in the village, then people say, look, why did you start? We told you in the first place, don't do all this nonsense. Right? So there's some very interesting angles to this. I think in the case of entrepreneurship, people have gone out, started their own enterprises, however small scale it might be. Often things turn out to be quite much better. The best way to look at this, of course, I think all of you have probably read, biographies, right? Autobiographies, especially of, the Dalit autobiographies that are coming out. And migration is such a central theme in almost all of them. And the book documents that. Narendra Jadav's book, Untouchables, has the whole thing on migration and how that was so important. And there's some other books described in this. Baluta is another thing.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
I guess I was referring more to, maybe this is a bad example, but I was reading A Fine Balance, which is a novel by Rohit in the Street. And one of the 4 stories is this Chamar, two people from this Chamar community going and becoming tailors and then returning and facing intense violence and discrimination because they tried to engage in an occupation that was above their caste. Yeah. So does that happen?
The caste group punishment?
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I don't have numbers or, I don't know if it's a question, does it happen? I guess it does happen at some point. Yeah. But at least in, in scholarship, it's not been documented that well. But I think it ties with this point of what these entrepreneurs were saying, right? That is, we like to be in the city because there's nobody to see our failures. And hence, we can continue failing till we actually succeed because it takes a certain amount of time. I think that would be sort of, response. This thing on skill sets, so I think the question is, do skill sets still matter today? Historically, we know caste, occupation, very, very clear relationship. But I think you must read the chapter on the migration of capital in the book, because that really tells you the story of how these guys went up, around India, spotted opportunities, and really built, substantial capital for them. Today, we know in academia, in the IIMs, for example, right, the faculty is pretty much completely drawn from one social group or maybe 2 social groups. We know for a fact in the world of business, corporate directors, I mentioned, Brahmin Banya, 90% of the 1,000 top directors in India. Now, how much of this has a migration story? I argue in the book that this is a migration story. So this is an informational network that that has been created. But at the lower end, also economists have sort of documented that recruitment in jobs. There's a paper by Vegard Iverson, Kunal Sen, is even today mediated by caste. But this is a very different thing. This is because, again, that recruiter happens to be of a particular caste, and that guy gets his basically brethren to the city. So that is one of the way how these networks start, because your chacha is there, so you go, and then that's how that whole cluster happens. And of course, like this Odia plumbers, that's the most famous stereotype. Malayali secretaries or clerical jobs. In India, in any institution you go, overrepresented by Keralites. Bengali economists, it's over-representation. The other thing out here is also demonstration effects. If you see success, a lot of people cluster there. Right? So the reason why Saurashtra Patel's emergence, this diamond thing, is because they could see in front of their own eyes the guys who are working in the Karkhana is suddenly now this crorepati. So that gets you a lot of success. So if you see Amartya Sen, all the Bengalis want to do economics. So that's a huge part of a role model, a demonstration effect is one big reason why people cluster into certain of a particular occupation. This point of Jains all around. There's no doubt, the Jain assimilation is a very strong story because they learn the local language. They really do. But as I mentioned, these guys are both celebrated and vilified at the same time. So people, it's amazing how so many cultures in India have this notion of a Marwadi parasite. So Bengalis hate them. Bengali means non-Marwadi. Bengalis hate them, and so on. But I document some of the things that they did. But they also set up relief associations. So the refugee crisis, it was the Marwadi Relief Association which helped many of these people. So they've also had very important contributions in philanthropy, right? And initially, many of these philanthropic contributions were community-based. It was only for the community. The Parsis were arguably the first who started a secular philanthropy. So they started like hospital or something where everyone could go. It's not just a temple where I and you can, go. And over time, I think other communities have also started emulating that. In terms of global warming, absolutely right in the sense that this is a big issue in the next 30-40 years. Now, what can you do about it? If you take a very strict policy point of view, you'd say, okay, it doesn't make sense to now start having cities on the coasts. Let's start having cities inland, and that might make more sense. I would disagree with that view. Okay, I think the evidence based on global warming is such. What if it becomes so bad that everyone is affected everywhere, right? So do you really want to, because if you actually take a view that, you want to forcefully relocate economic activity, that's a huge decision to make, right? And the substantial opportunity cost as well. When there are still so many unknowns, do you really want to make that decision? So I would rather sort of, from a policy framework, think of a way to, mitigate the downfall of this, because we know there are tremendous gains of being on the coast. The reason why coastal India is so much more richer than hinterland India, the tremendous gains, international trade, well, in the case of India, also monsoon. Just a lot of gains that happen on the coast. I mean, there's a paper called the United States of America as a Coastal Nation. I don't know the exact numbers, but the bulk of economic activity in the US happens on the coasts. So we know from economic geography that coasts matter. So if you're actually taking a view that, you want to move things inland, there are massive, massive economic costs. So I would rather think of New York or Mumbai or Calcutta start making plans of addressing potential storms and stuff like that, rather than a wholesale movement of cities in their own right. And what we know is it's very tough to move people just on the basis of some distant unknown. So if there's a Hurricane Florence, yes, you can see it happening, so you can move. But if you tell people, okay, 30, 40 years, things are going to get bad, it's very tough to convince people to. So I don't know how realistic it is to have a policy which says, vacate these places. On the thinness of migration, Vijay, so this is a great point. And if I'm not mistaken, Isabel Wilkerson spoke in this forum. So she's got this great book, The Warmth of Other Suns, and that's about the great migration of African Americans from the American South to the North. And that's the fundamental difference between the African Americans in the US and Dalits in India. That is, the geographical concentration of African Americans was very strong in a particular part of the country. Whereas in India, it's broad-based, right? So you do have variation. For example, in Ratnagiri, it's less than 10% is what you would consider a scheduled caste. The overall Indian average is about 22%, but there are districts where it's 10%, there are districts where it's 30%. But it's not like there's a whole cluster of districts in India where you have, and that's why you can't get a phenomenon like the Great Migration, because there is no one cluster, right? So I think the only way it can happen is through education, is through networks, is through forums like the Boston Study Group, which actually start sort of disseminating information and which, serve as springboards so that everyone can sort of migrate. I mean, migration should not be confined to only certain social groups. So that's, education and, advocacy for, or even not a general advocacy for migration, but stopping this advocacy of prohibiting migration. So you don't have to actively facilitate or encourage migration. But the current thing often in India is it's still such a strong bias, saying that, let's let people live in the villages. That is where, and that's this whole Gandhian philosophy. And now that's gaining more traction because of the environmental movement, right? And people are saying, all this city thing is all fine, but let's go back to Gandhi, because that's, the environment is pure. Cities are destroying the world. And maybe I'm an urbanist, and I think this is crazy. And virtually all of us are living, urbanists in some sense. And this is not a view to say that you should not do anything for the villages. But it's again to restate, when you do something for villages, people will leave. To recognize that fact. That is the thing. Right.
When I got a government scholarship, you want to final?
It's about this staying within the villages and all this. there is one more aspect to that because the land is limited. So the family which their forefathers have the land, now then there it has been divided between their children and now it has been divided between their grandchildren. So basically the amount of the land now this new generation's own is very less, and it is not very sustainable for that family to live on that particular limitations. And that's why it makes more sense for them to move away from the villages to the urban area. And I believe that is why Baba Sahib also said the same thing. Is unless they move out of the villages, one reason is basically there is a lot of atrocities happening within the villages as compared to the urban area. And another thing is unless they move out of the villages, they will not have growth.
That's an important point.
Can we just take his? It's a comment. I believe that's right.
Hi, my name is Anubhav. I'm a grad student of Thackeray School. So you talk about the rise of Bal Thackeray and a sort of a lack of a better word I refer to as an ethno-fascist. There are similar sentiments, anti-immigrant sentiments which have resonated across India in different parts. For example, we have ASU and ULFA in Assam, and there's already an NRC exercise going on in Assam. How much do you think would you argue, or rather, can it be argued that the rise of such ethno-fascist movements in India have coincided with the decline of class-based movements?
Okay. Yeah, that's a very deep question.
We can think of.
I have no off the cuff response. All I can say is the height of these movements were the 60s and 70s. What you're talking about, even at the Assamese, and the reason why Myron Weiner wrote a book was in the 60s and 70s because that was such a burning issue. But that was also the height of class-based movements. So just on this pure correlation, I would think that there's not much of a relationship, because we're talking of the height. 60s, 70s, really, India, the socialist rhetoric very strong, but at the same time you had this massive nativist things, at least in Bombay and Assam. So I don't know I'm not clear what's the relationship. Maybe there's something.
Because in Bombay, what was happening with the rise when Bal Thackeray was coming to the fore, most of the trade unions were under CPIM.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So there was also a streak of violence which happened with the rise of Bal Thackeray between there were cadres of Shiv Sena and CPIM clashing in the streets. And with that, CPIM lost a lot of sway among the trade unions, and Shiv Sena now controls the trade unions. That is what I was wondering.
Right.
How much of it was a class-based movement?
Yeah, you can think that maybe.
Yeah.
So on this note, what Chinmay has essentially on one point he ended up was this kind of feeling of loyalty and disloyalty to, if you are living in a village and if you are in a country, there is always this sense of belongingness and non-belongingness. When I had gotten a scholarship to go and study in England, I was having this pressure: am I betraying my motherland? This is how it was kind of built up with the narrative of kind of migration and anti-migration sentiments. This lecture was organized, co-sponsored by Boston Study Group. We have a ritual towards the end of lecture. We have the president of Boston Study Group and the leadership will hand over a small token of appreciation to the speaker.
Thank you.
Have you signed up into the mailing list? Please do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. You want to continue?
No, just only thing I wanted to say that we are having these lectures every month, and the sign-up sheets is very important because we include these names in our announcement list. So whenever we have the lectures, you automatically get emails from that. And that's the whole purpose of. And at the same time, we gauge how much response we are getting from the different people.
And we can get shy.
Exactly. And that's the main reason. So please sign up if you are not already done that. And thanks for coming.
Next month, October 8th, Ken Cooper, who was the former Washington Post South Asia bureau chief and now currently editor at the WBUR, is going to speak on media and diversity, and is going to drop on his experiences as an African-American journalist in India and taking experiences of the lack of diversity within the Indian media space. October 8th. More till later. Thank you all.
Yeah. One last announcement. Yeah. So there are books there, right? Now you can pay anywhere from $0 to $10. There's a box. feel free to take it for free. But I have paid $10, so don't pay more than $10. That's all I can say. So there's a box there. Feel free to,
Thank you.
Is that an Ambedkar head?